1 Corinthians chapter 9. We'll be picking up where we left off in our study on Wednesday evening, continuing the section on eating meats sacrificed to idols. The outline for chapter 9 and chapter 10 are on the same page, one on one side, one on the other. They're on the back table under the picture board. If you want to pick one of those up, of course, we're already in chapter 9, but it'll help you give you an outline that we'll be following in chapter 10. Before we get into chapter 9 itself, let's quickly remind ourselves of what we've seen, or the outline of the book, and then catching us up into chapter 8, getting ready to lead into chapter 9 as it's a continuation of the same thought. The book of 1 Corinthians, as we've been talking about, is about contentions among you. There was a problem where there were contentions at Corinth. To say there's contentions at Corinth would be a bit of an understatement. There were many contentions at Corinth. Many problems that they had, and the book is dealing with those problems. Chapters 1 through 6 was problems Paul learned about report. So divisions, problem of fornication, discipline, and litigation. Those are all problems you learn about report. 1 to 4, that's the division. I'm with Paul, Paul is Cephas, or I'm with Christ. They were all divided. They couldn't all agree. They were choosing a favorite preacher, and 1 through 4 deals with that. Chapter 5 and chapter 6, both parts of them deal with the sin of fornication. Chapter 5, the fornicator among them in the beginning, well, really the whole chapter. Chapter 6 deals with fornication at the end of the chapter, and the need to flee from fornication. Chapter 5 deals with the fact they haven't disciplined the fornicator among them. And then chapter 6 deals with the problem of going to law against one another. Chapter 7 then begins questions the Corinthians asked Paul. And that spans chapter 7 through chapter 14. So chapter 7, questions about marriage. 8, 9, and 10, meat sacrifice to idols. Chapter 11, the covering and the use of the Lord's Supper. And chapter 12 through 14, the spiritual gifts. Chapter 15 then was false teaching on the resurrection. And chapter 16, the collection and salutations. We're still in that second section on questions the Corinthians asked Paul in the second subsection. So going back real quick, we're in that second subsection, subpoint B, meats sacrificed to idols. We're getting ready for chapter 9. Let's quickly remind ourselves of chapter 8, because that's going to help us in getting into chapter 9. I said the other day there are 3 units of chapters in 1 Corinthians. And what I mean by units of chapters is there's 3 different sections in there where there are about 3 or more chapters. Sometimes it's 2, but in 1 Corinthians there's 2 with 3 chapters or 4 chapters, units that all deal with the same thought. And so it may span multiple chapters, but it's all dealing with the same thought. So at the beginning of the book, we had a unit of chapters over their divisions in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so there's a unit of chapters. Chapters 8, 9, and 10, eating meat sacrificed to idols, is our second. The final one we haven't got to yet, that's 12 through 14 on spiritual gifts. This is a unit of chapters. It's important our understanding of one in helping us go into the next. As we go from 8 to 9 and then to 10, we're still dealing with the same thing. We're just dealing with it from some different aspects or different arguments Paul's raising. So let's get into chapter 8 and then we'll leave that into chapter 9. Chapter 8, eat meat sacrificed to idols. So verses 1 through 8 talk about the fact that not all have the knowledge that an idol is nothing. If you recall from Wednesday evening, we talked about the fact that Paul said all have knowledge, but the English Standard Version puts that all of us possess knowledge in quotation marks, seeming that was their viewpoint. They were saying, we all have knowledge that an idol is nothing. When in reality, while some of them knew that the idols weren't a real God, they still didn't feel comfortable eating meats that might have been sacrificed to idols. Right? The meats from the marketplace they could purchase. They didn't feel comfortable with that. And so, here we have in chapter 8 that some of them saying, well, we all have this knowledge. The problem is that knowledge puffs up. Right? It makes them arrogant. And we looked on Wednesday at the use of that phrase throughout the Bible. And really, 1 Corinthians is all but one occurrence in the New Testament of this Greek word occurs in 1 Corinthians. And here was a people that were puffed up. They were saying, well, listen, I know an idol is nothing. You ought to know an idol is nothing. As you come later on in the chapter, he would point out in verse 7, though, that however not all possess this knowledge. They may realize there's one true God, but they don't to say, well, I'm going to eat this because they grew up perhaps worshiping idols. And they would eat that meat in honor or in sacrifice of an idol. And even though they wouldn't be eating it in honor of an idol, now that would still be wrong. And it would be wrong eating it in honor of an idol. Even though they may not be eating it in honor of an idol now, they can't help but associate that with when they did. And so they avoid eating it. In verse 9 beginning then, Paul talked about the fact that their liberties can become a stumbling block. That's important to the chapter. We're not dealing with matters of here's what's right and here's what's wrong in 8, 9, and 10. This is a matter of liberties or indifference to God. Is it wrong for them to eat that meat from the marketplace? No. But do they have to eat the meat from the marketplace? No. So it's a matter of liberty. It's an indifference to God. It's not a matter of right or wrong. Some have then taken their liberty or their right, as the ESV readers in verse 9, and have made it a stumbling block. Some of them, it seems, perhaps were going into the temple even eating and saying, listen, here's how strong I am. And it's also in this midweek in verse 10, where it talks about going into the idol's temple, even if they didn't go into the idol's temple and they were serving it on their table. You've got brother so-and-so here, he doesn't think he can eat this meat, brother so-and-so over here thinks he can, and this brother invites this brother over and puts the meat in front of him, and he doesn't want to feel rude and not eat it, so he eats it, but he violates his conscience. This one has put a stumbling block before him. And that was pointed out in the text. By doing so, by their knowledge they said they had, they destroyed the weak person, the brother for whom Christ died, verse 11. Thus, sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So Paul says at the end of verse 13, here's the solution. If meat makes your brother stumble, the solution is, don't eat meat. If it makes your brother stumble, don't eat meat. Now let's get ready for chapter 9. That's going to lead us in chapter 9, which is the example of Paul. Perhaps some of them are saying, Paul, that you're talking a big talk, but would you really do it? Would you really deny yourself of this liberty for the sake of your brethren? That seems to be perhaps a question they have, and it's what Paul deals with here before that came to raise. Maybe they already had this mindset. But either way, chapter 9 is about the example of Paul, and more specifically, the example of Paul denying himself liberties or rights. And as you go on later in the chapter, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not even we. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. And we'll talk about what that right is in a minute. But let's just get the idea here. He said in verse 12, it's a right. Verse 15, but I have made no use of any of these rights. That word rights is the same idea as what we've been saying as liberties, right? He has the right to that, or to do that. And yet he's denied himself. We'll see that in the text. Two main sections in the chapter. We've got the example of Paul denying liberties, and then he's going to come at the end of the chapter and explain a little bit more about why that's important at the end. But here's the example of Paul denying liberties. First and foremost, Paul denies liberties. Paul argues in 1 through 14 that he has the right to support. Let's begin at verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who examine me. Now, if you recall from 2 Corinthians, now we're all more familiar with this epistle to Corinth, but 2 Corinthians, there's a large portion of that in which Paul has to defend what?
His apostleship.
His apostleship. There are those at Corinth that are calling into question his apostleship. Verses 1, or chapter 9, here's some of these arguments, particularly 1 through 3. It's kind of a little bit of a look into what we're going to see when we get to 2 Corinthians, where he's going to be arguing about defending his apostleship, where some of them seem to call it into question. And he says in verse 1, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? He's giving his qualifications for being an apostle. He said in verse 2, if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. Even if others say, well, Paul's not really an apostle, they ought to know. Why ought they to know? They've seen his work. They've seen, he worked among them for a time. In fact, he says, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. All the things that Paul does among them, in fact, again, 2 Corinthians, he talks about some of these things and coming back to them. They should have known that that he's an apostle. Now here's why that I think is brought up in this chapter. It seems as though, and we'll see this more as we get into the text, that some of them are thinking, well, Paul hasn't received the support for his work like maybe Peter or John or some of these others have, and so is Paul really an apostle like they are? Maybe he's an apostle, but maybe he's just not as much of an apostle as a Peter or a John or some of these others. That seems to be perhaps their thought. And again, as we go farther into the text, he argues about support. That would seem to indicate that even more.
In the second letter, he will say, I don't want yours, I don't want your stuff, I want you. He said, I'm willing to be spent, or I'm willing to be spent for you. In other words, his possessions, his time, everything that he had stewardship over, he was willing to use for their benefit. But he said, the more I love you, the less I'm loved. He said, but that be as it may, that didn't deter him. But sometimes when perhaps we're not thanked or rewarded, or that love or whatever isn't reciprocated back to us, it can kind of undermine us. But Paul pressed forward in spite of this, but it wasn't the right thing for them to do. They should have had an appreciation for him. Because I'm sure as a preacher, if occasionally you hear somebody say, hey Micah, that sermon really helped me. Well, that's gonna build you up. If you never hear anything, then on the other hand, then maybe where you need, kind of lift it up at times, maybe that just doesn't happen. So we can apply this today. But the point being that Paul, he presented himself as a living sacrifice to do them good, and that was a demonstration of love, but apparently they didn't perceive it as love, and they didn't love him back like they should.
You're right, and not just love, they didn't love him back. They're calling into question all his work, and yet he's one who did a lot of the work among them at the beginning of the church there before Apollos came, and yet they seem to be they're calling into question his work as apostle. Well, he's a preacher, but he's really an apostle, seems to be the point that they have.
In King James, it says, it's verse 1. Are ye not my work in the Lord? So they were the example, a good example of his work. They sealed him. You said sealed. So they were his work, but they were thinking physical. He wasn't getting the support and the stuff. They were thinking physical instead of spiritual, and that's where they went wrong. Which actually,
right. And again, they're thinking, well, he doesn't receive support for what he does, so is he really as much an apostle? That today may be the mindset. There may be one who is full-time preaching. They're doing the work full-time, but maybe they also have a secular job. Maybe they want to preach and they're working in a place that can't support them, and so they can't raise the support, and so they work another job. They work a secular job to be able to support their family, but they want to continue in the work of preaching, and they're preaching for work, and somebody will look at them and say, well, is he really a preacher? He's not receiving support. That doesn't make him any less of a preacher than the man over here that's receiving tons of support. It's the work that's being done. And they're seem to be arguing here, well, he's not receiving the support, so is he really an apostle? Now, Paul's going to talk next about 3 liberties he denied himself. And we're talking about there could be another aspect, but I think all of these tie into his support of the gospel. First of those is verse 4. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Could he be talking about the eating of meats? Perhaps. But more likely, based on the context and everything around it, his point is, as they seem to be talking about the support, and him, as he's going to come later on and talk about denying the support, is do we not have the right to eat and drink? To receive support? Think about this. I think there are 2 aspects when this is done with the support of a preacher. One of them is, I receive support from the church here. I can go buy groceries to feed me and my family. You know what I use with that support? I can go buy groceries, right? So in an indirect way, part of my support is the receiving of that food. There's times where somebody may go in a meeting, and they're staying in a hotel in an area and there's maybe a restaurant next door, or maybe a restaurant in the hotel, and the church says, well, for your meals, if nobody's taking you out, you go down there to that restaurant and eat and have them put on tap. Basically, we're going to cover your food expense while you're here, right? That's part of his support that he received. Right? He's receiving that support for his work. So Paul has the right to eat and drink. The support that he receives to be able to go out and to purchase food, or even if for part of his support gave him something to eat. The next of those, he mentions in verse 5, is about having a wife. Now, there are two aspects. We'll talk about this in a second. Let's read verse 5. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of our Lord and Cephas? So there's a couple of questions here. One of those is Paul saying, listen, I have the right to get married, and yet I have refused that right. But I don't know that that's necessarily what Paul's saying. First of all, Paul says, do we not have the right to take along a believing wife? Now, I'm not talking about what's wise or unwise. Is it unwise? Is it always wise for a Christian or a non-Christian? No, it's not the wisest thing. But here we look at this and it says, a believing wife. Go back to chapter 7. Were there those that were married that were Christians and non-Christians? So is that a matter of right or wrong? No, not if they were not bound to anybody else before, right? They were bound to one another. They had the right to get married. Seems perhaps more likely what he's saying is not I have the right to get married, but rather I have the right, if I was, to go in the preaching and receive support and to be able to take my wife along with me. Listen to what the King James Version says here. Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? So it seems perhaps the idea here in verse 5 is not I have the right to a wife. That's true, he has the right to get married. But perhaps the thought seems more, I have the right to get married, and in my work, to take her along with me, and if the church supports me, to support her going with me. So a church may have a preacher for a meeting that's on the other side of the country. Say we're having a preacher that's all the way out of California for a meeting. That's a long drive, so he's going to fly, and he wants to bring his wife with him. So we might cover his plane ticket to travel out here and her to come with him, right? And so that's what seems to be the point Paul's making. I have the right to support, and if I had a wife, to take her along with me, yes.
I think about what Paul wrote was at the church of Thessalonica. He said that, or maybe Timothy, I can't remember, he said if a man doesn't provide for his own, he's worse than an infidel. So if you would struggle, even though you're laboring in the gospel, to support your family, when we could support you, okay, then what are we doing? We're making it more difficult for you to provide for your own. We're making it more difficult for you to not be worse than an infidel. So by extension, when this support is given, then actually it's helping that minister, if he is married, supply for his family, which is another command of God. So it just kind of makes that the minister's obedience to provide for his family easier.
Yes, you're right. And that support makes it easier. Paul had a wife and he wanted to take her with him, and he's receiving support. It makes it a lot easier than him going to preach for long periods and then having to go make tents and make burial. I don't know what a tent maker made in the first century, but if he's struggling, he's got to go spend the time doing this and working on the gospel and all these other things, and it's hard for him to get the support. It makes life more difficult in him providing. Now, verse 6 is the next liberty, and that's going to go all the way through verse 14. There are three. The first liberty is we have the right to eat and drink. The second, the right to take along or to lead a believing wife. The third is the right to support, which is really what I think all these others tie back into. But that's the main argument he makes. Verse 6, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serve as a soldier at his own expense, who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit, or who tends to a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not speak certainly for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? We'll come back to verse 12 in a minute. So Paul here, beginning in this next section, talks about taking wages for preaching the gospel. And he says in verse 6, he says, it's just Barnabas and I that need to refrain. Let's keep this in mind. We'll come back to this later on. Remember, those at Corinth have a tendency to be heavily critical of Paul where they may not be critical of others who are doing the same work. Or they call into question Paul's apostleship Even though the others would suggest he's just as much an apostle as Peter, Cephas, as he's referred to here in the book of 1 Corinthians. And so it seems as they're saying, listen, as if they're acting like Paul's never denied any liberties, and Paul's saying, listen, I have the right to support. Or if you're really looking back like, do you not have, or you're not receiving support, are you really saying, I don't have that right? Peter has that right. John has that right. Apollos has that right. It's just Barnabas and I that don't have that right. He comes to verse 7 and uses 3 illustrations to prove his point. Number 1, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? If somebody serves as a soldier, they receive pay. They receive compensation. Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? If you plant a vineyard, you may give some fruit or sell some fruit, but you know what else you do? You eat the fruit that you got from your vineyard. Or who tends to the flock without getting some of the milk? If you tend the flock and you receive milk from it, you may sell some of that, but you know what else you do? You drink some of it, right? They have the right to receive that. So he says in verse 8, do I say these things on human authority, okay? He's given his argument in verse 7, and now he says in verse 8, is this human authority? Paul's saying, am I making this argument from the human standpoint? Is this what I think? That is what Paul's really saying. He says, does not the law say the same? Now he's shifted. He said, okay, here's the illustration. Now you're starting to listen, you're going, well, that makes sense. Right? The soldier receives compensation. Somebody that has a vineyard gets the fruit. Somebody that has the tends to the flock gets some milk. Those all make sense. But Paul, where are you getting your authority from? Paul says in verse 8, it's not human authority. And the law says in verse 9, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads up the grain. If you write in your Bible, you want to make a note, that's Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, you shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. Now, he then raises this question, is it for oxen that God is concerned? Did God write that to make the argument for the oxen? Or is he saying this is showing us that the labor is
where they desire.
Where they desire. Like he comes to verse 10 says, does he not speak certainly for our sakes? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher should thresh in hope of sharing the crop. You plow, you thresh, you should have the hope of sharing in the crop. Verse 11, if we then have sown spiritual things, right? He used the illustration of the plowman and the threshing. He says, now we've sown spiritual things among you. Is it too much if we reap material things from you? Paul's saying, listen, if we were among you teaching spiritual things, is it too much that we receive some support for that? And the answer is no.
Hey, Mike, I think about, to me, the way I look at things in life, I've seen up where I work, they'd take up a collection for somebody that's having a hard time, maybe a house fire or whatever, and people would generally give or whatever, But I know one case where a guy's grandson got hurt, and they had taken up for him, but then they went to take up for this other guy, that his wife had cancer, and he got real mad and started attacking the character. But he'd already received help, when his grandson got hurt in the military, but then when they come to ask about to help somebody, his wife had cancer, he actually got belligerent and stuff and started attacking the man's character, the guy that had his wife had cancer. But my point is, you look at Barnabas, if they would have known his background, he sold a field. He sold a piece of ground, and he brings this money and lays it at the apostles' feet. And to me, maybe I'm wrong in this, but when you see somebody that's demonstrated such generosity, you'd think, hey, this person, when the shoe was on the other foot, was so willing to help financially other people who were in need. You know what I mean? And to me, that would just, if I don't know if they had insight into the fact that Barnabas had done this thing or not, but if they would have, and you reason through things, you think, well, hey, if this man does have a need, I would be more than happy to let my goods be plundered to help this man that helped others. Not that we wouldn't help somebody that maybe didn't help others, Mike, that's not what I'm saying. But it makes it a whole lot easier. I know out Pleasant Valley there was a guy, he fell on hard times, and he was real reluctant to take any funds from anybody. But there was another guy before him that had hard times. And this guy, he was very generous. He was the first one in line to help give. But when he fell on hard times, he was kind of reluctant to take the ultimate acceptance of help. But I mean, it all goes back to the heart. But to me, when you see the generosity of Barnabas, it should be, hey, this man, he's not materialistic. He's not in it for the money. He's already demonstrated that by his past action. And that should motivate.
You're right, and in fact, as we come later on, it seems some of them perhaps think Paul's in it for the money. We'll come to that later on. Peter receives support. We'll come to that again here in a second.
Micah, why were the Corinthians so critical of Paul?
That's a good question. I really don't know why they were so heavily critical of him, but it just seems, perhaps because of his, and it seems to become more critical maybe in the second letter than the first, or somewhat critical in the second letter, they may be more critical. Perhaps it's because of how he wrote to them. I know in the second epistle it's talked about how basically he's real strong when he writes, but when he's not here, he's not as strong. And they were sort of, some of them I think seem to think he was sort of hiding behind pen and paper maybe. And that a real apostle would confront them face to face, and he wasn't able to come to them at the time. So I think that may have played somewhat a part in it, particularly the second one. But as for the rest of it, I'm not really sure what it was that led them to be so heavily critical of him, except, maybe they were just comparing him too much to other people. Like Apollos, who's this great speaker. Peter, who's one of the original apostles, and so maybe they sort of threw him in a different category. Because he wasn't the best of speakers, and he was one, as he points out in the 15th, born out of due time, not one of the original 12 chosen.
That lack of gratitude from the Corinthians wasn't a matter of indifference. It was a matter of sin. Because Paul wrote, I believe it's 2 Timothy chapter 3, a whole list of sins. And one of those things are being unthankful. So this wasn't a matter of this was acceptable. No, the fact that they lacked his gratitude and didn't express it to Paul, that was sin. I mean, we can't cover it up. We can't say, well, it's a gray area. No, according to, I believe 2 Timothy chapter 3, that's unthankfulness is listed right in with a whole bunch of what we call grievous sins.
Oh, you're right. It is a sin, and yet here they were ungrateful, and for all the stuff, work he had done and others had done. Some of the others had done among them, while they were very grateful for the work of some of them. It seems like Cephas and Apollos. Verse 12 then, we already read this a moment ago. If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? So you're willing to support others. Paul's saying, if they have the claim to receive support from you, do we not? Right? They were the sign, as I said earlier, or seal of his apostleship. Nevertheless, we have not made use of that right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. Right? That's interesting. Paul says, by receiving support, he might have, verse 12, put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. You say for a second, hang on, how does he put an obstacle? That brings back to something I alluded to a moment ago. Again, they're already critical of him. They then become more critical of him, it seems, in the second one, that perhaps Paul's thought behind this is, if I receive support because of the way they sort of view him very critically, they might look at it and say, now, you know what, Paul, he's only in preaching for the money. That's why Paul's in preaching. And see, maybe that would have been their viewpoint. That might become the obstacle in his teaching. Well, he's just sort of in it for the money. And that might have been what some of them thought if he had been receiving or preaching and receiving the support. They might not view others that way. In fact, he said in verse 12, that's their rightful claim on you. It seems they're helping others, but they're not helping Paul. And Paul's saying, listen, we have that right, but I didn't so it can become an obstacle. Do you not know, verse 13, that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the word commanded then that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Paul says it might have become an obstacle, but I denied it. I have that right. Again, verse 13, it goes back to the old law. If you write in your Bibles, note this here. Verse 13 and 14, particularly verse 13, is not a quotation, but it is an allusion to Leviticus 6 and 7 about the food when they would come and offer the sacrifice, and the priest then could take part of that to eat. Right? The priest received that as a payment. Right? He received that as a right and a payment for the work that he did. Paul says, verse 14, in the same way the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Paul says, I should be receiving support for the work I do. Now, we don't have time to get there. Lord willing, on Wednesday we'll see. Paul says, now don't think I'm saying this because I want you to support me now. I'm not asking you to come support me now. I'm trying to illustrate a point. Here's the point. Let's get this, time's got away from us, but let's get this point before we finish this morning. Chapter 8, again, eating meats. Eating of meats is a right or a liberty. Paul said in verse 13, if that liberty of mine causes my brother to stumble, I should deny or refrain from that liberty. And some of them may be saying, well, listen, Paul, why are you saying that? You wouldn't do that. Well, Paul's not asking them to give up meat. He's just saying, don't eat that meat with a brother who is weak in conscience. And now we come to the ninth, and they're saying, well, Paul, what you going to do? Paul's saying, listen, I didn't deny myself of meat occasionally. I denied myself of my right to support for the work I've done. Doesn't mean Paul was never supported. We know he was supported in other passages. But when Paul was in court, he didn't receive support from them for the work he did. He worked as a tent maker. Okay? And then that's how Paul made his living. And Paul said, listen, if you don't believe me, I've got support. I worked with my hands like you do for my work and didn't receive support so that I not become an obstacle to the gospel. Lord willing, we'll pick up at verse 15 and talk about Paul foregoing his liberties and why that was on Wednesday evening.
Hey, Mike, I've heard preachers, you know what I mean? They got to preach the whole counsel, and giving's part of it, but that may be reluctant to preach and say that, well, I'm trying to get myself a raise. You know what I mean? That's not their intention at all, you know. But they're almost reluctant to preach on it and say that, well, I'm wanting more money or something. And that's not the case at all. It's part of the doctrine.
You're right. You're right. We'll pick up at verse 15 on Wednesday.